All right, so I got an update here for you guys on Afghanistan, where it appears like Joe Biden's sanctions on the country could end up leading to the deaths of millions of innocent civilians. So I got some good reporting here from The Nation, specifically from Brian Osgood, where he says that 1 million Afghan children could starve this winter, and he asked the question, are U.S. sanctions to blame? So let's just go ahead and get into some of the details, and then I'll give you guys my thoughts on this. So he says, following the Taliban takeover, the Biden administration froze $9.5 billion in Afghan assets and imposed sanctions that have devastated an already fragile economy. And he says, while the policies are aimed at isolating the Taliban, everyday Afghans are suffering and banks are running out of cash. The price of everything from bread to fuel is shooting up, imports have been crippled, and civil employees have gone months without being paid. President Joe Biden promised to promote human rights on the world stage, but his administration is now overseeing a sanctions regime that has pushed Afghanistan to the brink of famine, and barring major changes, over 1 million children could starve to death over the winter, according to the World Food Program and the Food Assistance Branch of the United Nations. So again, they say that, Joe Biden ran on being the type of guy who's going to promote human rights, but okay, that's absolutely laughably ridiculous. This is the same guy who gives unwavering support militarily, logistically, and financially to Israel, who then take our logistical and military support and go and absolutely obliterate innocent Palestinians. It's also the same guy who was recently just pushing through that $650 million weapons sale to Saudi Arabia, who are then going to turn around and use them on innocent Yemeni civilians to exacerbate the current worst humanitarian crisis on the planet in Yemen. And so, obviously this guy is not a guy who gives a single ounce or shit about human rights across the planet. Okay, so that's, laughable at face value. And this isn't even the only example in recent history of the United States weaponizing sanctions that end up killing civilians. Now, I got a couple different examples to just remind you guys of some of the most horrific things that we have done. This one was in Iraq, pre-Iraq war. In the 90s, the United States was slapping Iraq with absolutely insane sanctions, probably the most restrictive in history, basically, but these sanctions killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. We also have examples from Iran. This was just last year. As coronavirus cases explode in Iran, U.S. sanctions hinder its access to drugs and medical equipment, killing civilians. We also had this example from Venezuela under the Trump administration, and still currently under the Biden administration, but U.S. sanctions on Venezuela responsible for tens of thousands of deaths, claims new reports. So listen, I mean, this is like not something that we are necessarily opposed to in any way, shape, or form. We've been doing this consistently throughout at least very recent history, but this is something that the U.S. likes to do all the time. And does this mean that I'm against 100% of all sanctions in any circumstance, that there's no reason I could possibly justify in my head that some sort of a country or specific people within a country would deserve being sanctioned? No, not necessarily, but the reality of all of this is none of these sanctions are actually doing what the United States is claiming they are supposed to be doing, right? In the case of Venezuela, they're saying that these sanctions are supposed to, facilitate the overthrow, basically, of Maduro and overthrow that government. Well, how the fuck is that working out for you? I mean, you might see the byline here in this article specifically. Claim comes as U.S. seeks to dislodge the Venezuela president. So, they're trying to install a puppet in Juan Guaido, which obviously that has been a laughable failure, but the point is these aren't actually working to do anything. Even if you have valid criticisms of the authoritarian nature of any government around the world, then these sanctions are obviously not being effective in terms of unseating those people, or in terms of even under their own worldview promoting like national security or anything like that, promoting human rights. They're not doing anything like that at all. Okay, they're doing the exact opposite of that. They are restricting people's human rights and in fact killing innocent civilians. So they're not even effective under their own worldview of what they are saying these sanctions are supposed to be doing. So it's murderous. I mean, that's all you can really call it. But we continue here now with the Afghanistan specifics, because again, this is not something we are opposed to doing in a general sense. We've been doing it for years and years and years, and Joe Biden is still doing it even in other countries right now. So it's not just Afghanistan. This is a broader point to be made here, but they continue here saying that despite increasing calls to relax the sanctions, the Biden administration has shown few signs of changing course, and members of Congress have largely remained silent or voiced their support, with notable exceptions such as a group of 40 Democratic lawmakers who have urged Biden to unfreeze the Afghan cash reserves. And so this letter, as you see here, was signed by some notable members of Congress, pretty much everybody from the squad at least. You see Pramila Jayapal, Jamal Bowman, Ayanna Pressley, Mondaire Jones, Mark Pocan, Rashida Tlaib, AOC, Ilhan Omar, etc. So all of the people you would somewhat expect to sign a letter like this. So, credit to them for at least trying to apply pressure to the Joe Biden administration. But listen, the reason why Joe Biden is doing this, and the reason why I brought up these other examples of sanctions and how they haven't actually worked to do what the U.S. national security state claims that they want these sanctions to do, is because this situation has absolutely nothing to do with human rights, okay? Joe Biden does not give a single shit about human rights. So he's not imposing these sanctions on the Taliban because he thinks that it's going to have like a corrective measure on the behavior of the Taliban. And listen, I'm not a big fan of the Taliban, okay? They're extremely authoritarian, extremely brutal in every way imaginable, okay? Not a big fan of the Taliban, but what Joe Biden is doing here is not intended to improve the human rights of the Taliban or what they are doing to Afghan civilians. That's not the point of these sanctions. The point of these sanctions is basically almost entirely political, okay? Joe Biden saw how he got absolutely shat on by the mainstream media and by the national security establishment and from the Republican Party and even members of the Democratic Party as well. He saw how much he got absolutely obliterated on in the wake of leaving Afghanistan. And if you were watching my channel, then you would know that was one of the only things that I've ever given Biden, positive credit for or praised him for doing. And granted, it's not a complete withdrawal, right? We're still most likely going to be doing airstrikes in coordination with the Taliban in Afghanistan. We're most likely going to keep some sort of a covert presence in Afghanistan. So it remains to be seen exactly how that's going to play out in the long run. But I did give Biden credit for pulling our boots on the ground troops out of Afghanistan, and he faced a lot of backlash. Now, what he should have done in that moment is not lean to the right and then impose unnecessary sanctions that are going to kill Afghan civilians in an effort to basically appear strong to Republicans or anything. And why do I say that that's not going to be effective? Because they are going to blame you regardless, okay? They are going to blame Joe Biden regardless of what he does here. If he drops the sanctions, they're going to say he's weak on the Taliban, right? But that's what they said when he was leaving Afghanistan, even though that was the right thing to do, and the American people supported him leaving Afghanistan. But they're going to shit on him regardless. If he drops the sanctions, they're going to call him weak on the Taliban. If he keeps the sanctions, they're just going to say that the millions of Afghan civilians that are about to die this winter, they're just going to say that, oh, that's the result of us leaving, so Joe Biden, you never should have left Afghanistan. So either way, he's going to get attacked from the neocons. He's going to get attacked from the right on this specific foreign policy situation in Afghanistan. So what he should do is he should double down on the whole, leaving Afghanistan and pulling back our military presence overseas. He should double down on that and go and aggressively explain to people why these sanctions don't actually make sense in terms of a national security benefit to the United States. If anything, they're going to do the exact opposite. And I think they pointed that out here in this piece specifically. But if you let, millions of people die this winter, if you let Afghan civilians who, tens of millions of them don't have access to adequate water, adequate food, etc., then what do you think that's going to do to the national security situation in Afghanistan? Do you think that's going to stabilize the region? No, that's going to enhance the ability for extremist elements within Afghanistan to recruit and then thereby, reduce the national security benefit to the United States and to Afghanistan itself. So it doesn't make sense from any real angle in terms of why Joe Biden would be doing this, other than just political calculations that he is inaccurately making in his head and saying, well, I don't want them to call me weak on the Taliban, so I got to keep these sanctions in place. But that's murderous, it's psychopathic, and it's absolutely insane. So let's just go ahead and continue with some of the details. I just wanted to explain why this doesn't make sense from even a political angle as well. But they say that even before the Biden administration imposed sanctions that have isolated Afghanistan from the world financial system, the Afghan economy was struggling, and a withering drought decreased crop yields. The COVID-19 pandemic damaged areas of the economy, such as the service sector, and decades of war made for an unstable environment for doing business. No shit. Okay, again, the lesson here is that we never should have gone to Afghanistan in the first place. The lesson here isn't, we shouldn't have pulled out from Afghanistan. It's that we never should have been there and made this entire economy, basically, as they're about to point out here, reliant on U.S. foreign aid or reliant on U.S. military presence. That was the mistake, not leaving, okay? So they point out here that the Taliban's successful campaign to take power also resulted in another blow against the Afghan economy, the immediate disappearance of billions of dollars worth of foreign aid, and the U.S.-backed government had been largely dependent on international donations to function, with over 70% of public spending and over 40% of their GDP coming from aid, okay? That is absolutely insane, okay? And it wasn't necessarily going to aid that was actually benefiting average Afghan civilians. It was largely, we were dumping tens of billions of dollars into propping up this fucking, Afghan security, or propping up the Afghan military and their police forces, which fell apart in 0.2 seconds the second that we started to leave. Okay, so we spent all of this money dumping it into a government and dumping it into this entire enterprise that we were propping up in Afghanistan, and then the second that that collapses, no shit, you're going to have a large retraction in the economy if 70% of their public spending was reliant on the US and other international organizations giving them aid. That's just an absolutely psychotic way to try to establish a military presence in a country. If that was actually the goal, right, as they claim the entire way, the goal in Afghanistan, we're trying to build a democracy, we're trying to create a stable government that can last by itself in a sustainable way, that's not how you do it, okay? This is not at all a successful project in nation building as they try to portray it. So again, the lesson is not that we should have stayed there, it's that we never should have created an entire economy and a nation that was reliant on the United States military presence there in the first place. But they continue here saying that sanctions have created additional issues for humanitarian organizations still working in Afghanistan who cannot deposit funds in Afghan banks and can become excessively cautious out of concern that their activities may unintentionally run afoul of sanctions. They say, quote, if you're a humanitarian organization on the ground in Afghanistan and it's not totally clear what sanctions do and don't apply to, it can make it even more difficult to operate, said Sarah Rose, who co-authored a paper on the impact of sanctions for the Center for Global Development. They continue saying that for an already struggling economy, the sanctions and cash freeze have tipped the economy towards catastrophe, with the economy estimated to contract by 30%, and as a result, 23 million Afghans face starvation. 23 million people are facing starvation, largely due to the actions of the Joe Biden administration in imposing these sanctions on the country. Just again, we're talking about this could potentially develop into being the single worst humanitarian crisis on the planet, even worse than what is currently happening in Yemen, which Biden also happens to be largely responsible for. But they continue saying that the Shah Mehrabi, sorry if I mispronounced that, a professor of economics at Montgomery College and a board member of the Central Bank of Afghanistan, told me that people are starving, there is no employment, and people have no income. So listen, again, the broader point here is that Biden should absolutely drop these sanctions, just like he should drop the sanctions on Iran, just like he should drop the sanctions on Venezuela, because at the end of the day, okay, I'm not praising all of the aspects of these governments, right? I'm not praising the Taliban. That's not the point at all. The point is, what the fuck is your goal in doing this, right? You're not going to unseat the Taliban. That's very clear. You're not going to unseat Maduro. You've tried and you failed many times. You're not going to unseat, whoever's in power in Iran right now, or whoever's in power in Russia or China or any of these other. You might as well not impose these ridiculous sanctions on these countries, because all they're doing is killing innocent civilians, okay? Even if you have the worst authoritarian government in the world, you're still not going to actually effectively reduce their capacity to govern, because they're just going to continue enforcing whatever consequences there are as a result of the sanctions on the people who are the least able to basically defend themselves, which is the poorest people and the most vulnerable people within these countries. So it just doesn't make sense from any angle. You're not really accomplishing anything, but obviously Joe Biden is currently trying to do these mental gymnastics and make the calculations in his head politically that it is somehow worth it to let potentially tens of millions of people die. They said 23 million Afghans face starvation. So he's making the calculation in his head politically that it is advantageous for him to let 23 million Afghan civilians die. And if he did the opposite of that, basically he's fearing that Republicans would come and call him weak on the Taliban. So it's just an absolutely psychotic situation. And Joe Biden absolutely should drop the sanctions completely and allow Afghans to actually start to rebuild a country that we spent two decades absolutely destroying.